Let me flick it back to the...
Right, okay. Hopefully it's now started. Hello everyone, it's Katie Montgomery, and today I'm here with my friend, Dr. Rose Murray.
Hello.
Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yep, so I'm Rose, and I'm a biologist. My day job is teaching biology at university, so I'm a lecturer. Obviously this year that's going to look a little different, which is all exciting. But I'm here to give the kind of biological perspective on the things we're talking about.
Yeah, so... Oh, you need to turn the sound off on your phone. Me and Rose are bubbled together, which is exciting because it's the first time I've done any one of these like interview things, like where I've been able to see someone. And it's also meant a complete faff with like my setup because I've got all my lights set up for just me. And so now it's like...
I've caused a lot of trouble.
Yeah, so... But anyway, yeah, so it should be fun. So, so Rose is one of my best and oldest friends, and she's actually the first person I came out to when I came out. We were actually just talking about this. So I was like stressing and planning about what I was going to do to come out, and so I was like, I'll message Rose and see if she's free in the next few weeks to like have a talk.
You were like, are you free? I want to talk to you about something. Are you free? And I was like, I can't really sit on something not knowing what it is, and I had obviously no idea what it was about. So I was like, yeah, I can be free tonight.
And I was like, I'm not ready tonight. So I just got like really drunk. So one thing I should just do to check as well, is the sound working, everyone? Can everyone hear us? Yep.
I think because it was coming out.
Yeah, no, that's good. I was just checking. But yeah, anyway, so that was a funny thing, and I got absolutely plastered, and then was like,
are you okay?
Yeah, and she turned up just like totally sober at 6 p.m. Yeah, so that was really good. So anyway, I've got Rose here today to talk about the definition, adult human female, which is the definition for women that you'll find in a lot of dictionaries. And it's also kind of a key phrase in the like battle for trans rights, particularly in the UK. And it's interesting because at least one of the big dictionaries, Merriam-Webster, has just updated their definition for women to have a few other things, which includes mentioning trans women. And so the reason that this definition has become like a phrase that you'll see a lot is because the idea is to come up with some kind of reason why trans women aren't women and trans men aren't men, to try and sort of justify taking away their rights. And the idea is like, I'm not being transphobic in my position, I'm just pointing at some facts. It's just a fact. The dictionary says this. But
people like to fall back on the science, don't they, and say, we're going to cover a lot of these in this chat, but a lot of people say, well, you can't argue with science and nature, and that's just how it is. And so that's what we're hoping to try to unravel a bit, is to show that.
So obviously the first step that lots of people go to is the dictionary, and that's lots of the time where people stop and they'll say, well, definition of women is adult human female, therefore I win. And like, but what do those three words mean? Like, where have these definitions come from? I mean, they're not like, the dictionary doesn't decide what a woman is. Like, there's not the king of the dictionary doesn't just call these words. They're obviously describing something, and these descriptions come from other places. So yeah, we thought we'd go through these words, adult, human, and female, and just kind of address like these definitions and where they've come from and what that really means. Because you can't define a word with three other words and then not define those other three words and expect that to be an argument. So on the first one, adult. Sorry, I'm doing a lot of talking here. We'll get onto the biology in a minute. So on the first one, I guess people often just think, oh, well, I know what an adult is. Like in the UK, an adult is just anyone who's 18. Like, problem solved. But then in other countries, it's different. There are some countries where you have to be 21. There are some countries where people as young as like 12 can be considered an adult. And that can have some pretty grim consequences. I mean, one grim consequence is that Americans can't get drunk at university, but obviously there's some real serious consequences.
Well, there's a lot of child brides and stuff on there, in some really some countries where women or girls really are forced into marriage with someone who's often really, really old and many, many decades older than them. And they end up having children before their bodies are really ready. It's sending one message saying it's ready because they can conceive, but actually it leads to loads of health problems along the line.
Yeah, there's lots of things wrapped up in the definition of adult, and some things are just like drinking and driving, which is kind of arbitrary. But yet for some things it's very important, like you were just saying, which is where sort of the biology part of it is a common thing for lots of people is to say, well, we're not saying like the legal definition of adult. You're not like, because that's just an arbitrary number that we picked out of nowhere. We're actually saying like the biological definition of adult, and like what really does that mean? Because like one very common one, and I guess is the kind of plant and animal biologist like thing you would say. I don't know really what the word is, but like it's an adult is when it's reached sexual maturity.
Yeah, so that's when I was doing my research for this, that was the only real kind of biological thing I could come across, which was when an organism has come to its sexual maturity, meaning that it's able to reproduce sexually, which is problematic for lots of different reasons, because that works fine for, biologically fine for some organisms like humans, where, okay, there's a definite point where you reach sexual maturity for most women and most men, not everybody, and that's a whole nother kind of point which I'm sure we'll cover.
Yeah.
But also for organisms that don't reproduce sexually, of which there are countless examples. It's quite interesting actually that different sexes, this sort of differentiation in two different morphs, if you like, two different types of organism, only originated in the eukaryotic line, which basically covers...
What's a eukaryote? For the viewers,
I'm going to get really carried away now. But it's basically animals, plants, fungi, those kinds of things. There's two other major kind of domains of life which cover things like bacteria and archaea, which are kind of really ancient type of bacteria. So you're talking like those little bugs, basically.
Okay.
Anything that's not a bug. They still do actually reproduce, not sexually, technically, but they do exchange genetic information. But I don't know if I'm getting carried away.
No, it's all right. Just rant on. I'll cut you off if it gets boring.
Stop right now. The whole kind of point of reproducing sexually is so that you can exchange genetic information and mix up the different we call alleles, the different versions of genes which encode different characteristics. That's making it more likely that you're going to have a good combination which will enable you to survive and reproduce, therefore kind of continuing the pedigree line.
And so I guess some organisms are potentially able to exchange that genetic information very early on. If they have a simple process, then if they've grown to a certain size and they've got enough resources, then they're able to do that. Whereas other much more complicated animals and other living things need to grow a special structure, or they need special level of hormones, or all these other kind of things which gate off like sexual maturity.
Well, you were talking about cicadas earlier.
Yeah, well, yeah. So that's there are some animals where the life stage they have a sexual maturity which is gated off by a sort of complete change of to like a different form. So like the classic is caterpillars and butterflies, and in order to reproduce, a butterfly can't be in the caterpillar stage, like they just don't have that ability, they don't have the function. So in that case, it's very clear when they reach sexual maturity, because it's once they've come out of their caterpillar and pupa stage into their like adult stage. But for some animals, that's much less rigid. So even with humans, and I guess this is like a kind of a philosophy point, even if we were to say, okay, an adult is when someone is capable of sexually reproducing, even if that would cause detrimental health effects, and even if that was a horrible issue for consent and stuff, if we just did a raw like biology definition, that still would be impossible to draw the line, because is that today or tomorrow? Is that 4 p.m. or 3 minutes past 4 p.m? Like, at what point does... You don't just suddenly flip a switch. Like, you could say, oh, it's when you first menstruate, or it could be the first time that because you could have like an egg and it could not bind in the uterus or something, and there could, the first time you menstruate, you might not be fertile yet.
Yeah.
And there's so many different variables, I guess, to
there's
consider.
so many exceptions to that rule. So I think for women, it's once you get to the point of menstruation, that's quite a kind of, at least it's a kind of a marker. But even that is so fraught with problems because there are so many exceptions to that. Not all women menstruate. Not all women are capable of reproduction.
Not
they're not fertile.
Yeah, so for sure. And so then that means that obviously when we come to law, we can pick this 18 number out of nowhere and say, well, it's not out of nowhere. You know, people are quite grown at 18. They seem like idiot children to me now. Shout out
they
to all my 18-year-old
seem to be younger and younger each year to me.
Yeah, well,
I lecture them. Like,
I guess they are.
So
But it's a kind of an arbitrary line where we just hope that everyone has reached a certain level of maturity, or most people have reached a certain stage.
You're making a lot of assumptions about, cognitive ability as well. So not everyone develops their brain at the same rate. And so you might have some people where that's really delayed and actually they're not quite adult, or perhaps the other way around, where actually they're possibly more of an adult at 12 or something. But
adult in terms of like their final form of their brain.
Definitely all I can think about is Dragon Ball Z now. Not even my final form.
Well, yeah, it's because it's interesting because an argument that I've actually seen quite a lot when talking to like transphobes online is especially when they're talking about their own children, they'll say, well, no one should be allowed to transition until they're at least 25 because that is the time when your brain has like finished maturing. So you've got your sexual maturity, which, for some people could kick in as young as 8, which is really horrible to say that someone that young's an adult. It's horrifying. But then equally, it's kind of ridiculous to say you're not an adult until you're 25. Like, I mean, in one sense, your brain never stops growing. And I guess that, I don't know about brain development, but there's probably a point at which you can say stop. Yeah, like you peak. And for some people that could be earlier and some it could be older, but your different parts of your like cognitive ability can sort of almost go from nothing to fully powered at various stages of your life. Like you develop the ability to have short-term memories and that kind of grows and, finishes, and then something else happens, and there's lots of different sort of stages as you grow up. So drawing a line when that's kind of finished is not
it
really
is so arbitrary as well, because then, if we're saying, well, you can't do all these things until you're above a certain age, then, logically, we ought to then stop things at a certain age.
What, for mental ability?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not advocating that.
No,
like,
no, yeah, I mean, it's
not logical, is it? There has to be a case-by-case kind of analysis, and when you call someone an adult, there's different meanings when it comes to a biological perspective, a legal perspective, a social perspective, because even though 18 is an adult in our society, many adults don't even look at 18-year-olds as being adults.
It's Poppy. Poppy is an adult human female. No, an adult feline.
Definitely not a human. Adult feline.
Yeah.
Female.
Well, it's weird because...
Have some more wine and say that.
Yeah. So I think that even just like... often when this argument comes up... Oh, you're very honoured. I think often when this argument comes up, as we'll get onto later, like the female often becomes the point of contention. But I think it's interesting to point out that even adult, like you often just think, well, I know what an adult is. There are some, obviously like your mum is an adult and like,
Well, they may not be if they had a child really young.
Oh, that's true. That's a bad assumption. But I think when you think sort of...
I mean, if you're our age, they probably are.
Yeah. If you just think like when you're talking to most people, when you say adult, it instantly communicates what you mean. But actually, it is quite a complicated set of definitions. And if you just looked up adult in the dictionary and it said, the age of sexual maturity or the age of like legal maturity, both of those mean different things. And you can be an adult in one country and then not an adult in another country.
Yeah.
You could be an adult in the eyes of one biologist perhaps and not an adult in the eyes of another. So it's definitely subjective, which also, so I don't know is there anything you'd like to add on adult or age?
I don't think so. I think we've kind of covered the main points. And from a biologist perspective, it's this sexual maturity point, which, yeah, as we've alluded to, it's fraught with problems because not everyone could reach a sexual maturity according to a biology definition.
It's such a bad socially saying, oh, you're an adult when you're sexually mature. It just opens the door for all kind of, like you said, child marriages and abuse and things where they put children into the military and just like, there's so many problems with that. And it just would not be a sensible definition to have the legal one match, even if biological sexual maturity was a thing we could measure, which it isn't.
I guess you can, but there's too many exceptions to it.
Right, okay. I guess if you come up with a definition, you just say, if you've like menstruated, then you're an adult, then you can measure that, but then you can't then measure it in lots of other people. Yeah. So
Katie's cat is on my lap and she's being really sweet. Aww. I have a cat and she's not a lap cat. So this is really, I'm very honoured. Like, much like when Katie came out to me and I was the first one, I'm very, very honoured. And
Poppy's coming out to you.
I kind of want to show you. There she is. Oh, there you are, little girl. Okay.
So yeah, anyway. The next, the adult human female, I always think it's interesting that they put it in that order, because to me it feels like it should be adult female human, because the human is the important bit. That's the noun.
I think there's some grammatical rule about, was it a green glass?
I'm not sure what the rule is, but yeah, I think because there is some order and it's different for different languages, but it does seem odd to me that female is the noun that we're describing, and human isn't like an adjective in this
case, because a human is the thing, and a female or male or any other kind of descriptor is a description of that
type of human. But anyway, we'll go on to human next, because it's the one in the definition, this common definition, and this one's probably the most complicated in one sense and the most simple in another, in that we know what a human is, and there are no other animals that we're going to mix up with a human that are around today. It's not like you're going to, with an adult, you could encounter someone and you could be like, oh, is this person an adult or not? Like, how old are they? And, what biological stage of their life are they in? Whereas if you encounter someone, it's a human. There's no...
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on your understanding of human, because... Sorry.
No, go ahead. Tell me about these non-humans.
Well, I mean, if you're talking it from a morality perspective, is so-and-so human or humane? Like, that term is derived from it, right? So if someone's really evil, was Hitler a human? He wasn't humane.
Yeah, I guess so.
But then that's a different kind of way of looking at the word.
I guess that's like...
I'm probably not one for this topic.
I would say that... dehumanizing people is an important tool for any person who wants to take away rights, and it's a very common tool that dictators and fascists use, is dehumanizing, and I think that's a philosophy concept rather than a biology or legal one, because legally, I don't know, I'm sure there are some places where not all humans are human legally.
Literally, like slavery.
Oh, okay, yeah, exactly. But I think
and prisoners.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that at least we all agree that, I don't know, you can't really say anything safe like that. I would say that the legal definition of human is probably not very contentious to lots of people, because it's not like there are some...
Or at least the modern day. Sorry.
But yeah, I guess the biology point that I wanted to bring up with this is, it's a very common conversation when you're discussing evolution, is where was the first human? And who decides where to draw this line? So there would be creatures that we came from which were definitely not human. One of our common ancestors, way back in our evolutionary line, was definitely not human, and there are some now that definitely are human. And where do we draw this line? And if you went back in time, 50,000 years or something, and you came across some animal that looked like a human, would you know that it was a Homo sapien, or could it be one of the others? I'm not quite sure what the years involved are.
50,000 years ago, you'd possibly come across a Neanderthal.
And perhaps you would recognise it because they might look different, but they did interbreed with each other.
Yeah, I mean, so that's a really important point, actually. So, I guess there's a bit of groundwork that I think is probably worth going over. So all of life on Earth is descended from the same common ancestor. So all of like DNA-based life
that we've discovered.
Well, yeah. But you can look at the genetics of every living thing and work out that they did eventually diverge from a common ancestor that, lived however many millions or billions of years ago. But that gave rise to all different lineages of organisms.
Which is really cool.
Yeah, so we're related to everything that is live. No matter how distantly or closely. And so and the whole kind of process of speciation, so when new species come about, is quite complicated. It's not so clear cut as you might imagine. I certainly remember in school learning what a species is, and that was, two different groups. If you're a different species, it means you can't interbreed. It means all of these different things, which actually in the modern kind of definition, a lot of that, there's, again, loads of exceptions that it's not the case at all. And what happens for non-sexual organisms and so on. So there's loads and loads of reasons why that's... it's not a very good definition, actually. So you can look at it and, phylogeneticists and people much better qualified than me will be able to tell you when that kind of change happens and when you differentiate enough from another organism to become a new species.
And so this is an interesting thing that I recently learned from a video from Viced Rhino, who's on YouTube, and you should check him out. I'll put this thing in the description, who often discusses a lot about creationism and like evolution, and discussed about, I think it was a type of lizard from the Americas, where it's across the whole, like from North America down to South America, and the lizards in this kind of area can all breed with each other and create fertile offspring, and all these ones can breed with each other, and they can breed with the ones in next door, and so on and so on and so on. But the ones in the south can't breed with the ones in the north and make fertile offspring, though they all in a chain can breed with each other. So these two technically aren't the same species from that definition, but in another sense they are, because these can interbreed and then their children can interbreed and then their children can interbreed. So it's very... it's like a gradient. Differentiation happens slowly and over time, and you might even get a point where, say, if you had two islands separate, and you had like two types of parakeet or something that were diverging, there might be a point in time where if you picked any random two birds, one off each island, there might be like a 30% chance they'll be able to create fertile offspring, because they're just on the on the whole, they're just on the edge of becoming totally diverged, but there are some combinations, certain pairings of individuals which might still have the compatibility.
Yeah, for sure. And even now, established species can still interbreed. So like horses and donkeys can create a mule. Not that it's, I think, fertile, but you can get like a liger, lion and tiger. Is that Napoleon Dynamite's favourite animal? So there's loads of examples, and back in the day, early hominids. So there haven't always just been one species of humans, of hominids, of human-like creatures. There are actually loads of different species, and you can go back and look at the fossil record. And Neanderthals were a kind of Eurasian kind of colonizing species, and we can look at genetic analysis of remains of Neanderthals that people have found and modern day living humans, and see that there's actually quite a lot of interbreeding that happened in the past. So there was even, and there might have been reasons why this was beneficial for those people who then interbred to kind of survive more easily or whatever it was. But even then, a lot of modern day humans, not all modern day humans, carry a certain proportion of Neanderthal DNA within our genomes. So does that mean we are less of a human? Right.
Then so if you've got someone who has none of that DNA and someone who has, like they can interbreed, they're definitely both humans, but one of them has like some Neanderthal DNA, so they're like more Neanderthal. It's
so arbitrary.
It's an arbitrary distinction, and it's like a subjective definition, because it doesn't make...
It's a human-made thing. Like, humans love to put things into boxes, and that is, one of the problems with transphobia and humans like to be able to categorize things and say, well, that's that and that's that. But actually, the science of biology is that it's not very easy to do that at all, and often you'll get subspecies, and you can see where things are starting to diverge and to change, and that's the whole process of evolution. Otherwise, we wouldn't have all these different types of organisms living on Earth.
So I guess like biology as a whole is kind of humans' attempt to make sense of life that we see it, and our best way of making sense of it is to put things in boxes. And so draw out trees and maps and stuff. And in order to do that, we often just have to make these subjective decisions. And often, like today, be like, oh, well, that's a cat and that's a human. And we can put them in different boxes. And we can say they're both mammals because they're different to this fish. And that's quite easy.
Probably don't interbreed.
Yeah, don't try. but I think that gives you, especially when what you learn at school, that gives you this impression that biology is about discovering these true strict categories, these like I've discovered this new box and all of these are this new type of bird and that's it, and like, oh, I wonder what it's related to, but it's like a fixed box. But actually we've created this label to try and describe this like shape pattern that we've recognized, and biology itself, like the process, does not care what that we've labeled it or not. It might be able to interbreed with another one, it might not. It might have some DNA of something in it, it might not.
It's a human-made concept.
The whole process of labelling is a human.
And it's not to say that putting things in boxes isn't helpful to biology, because it is. That's how we learn about different organisms and how we learn about evolution and how a certain trait is beneficial or helping us understand diseases and that sort of thing. Obviously, it's really useful, but this concept that once you've labelled something a species, that it never changes and it's never questioned, is totally false, because species are around the kind of, I guess it's the turn of the century, we're into the noughties, DNA sequencing methods, the ability to extract an organism's DNA and actually essentially read the entire kind of code of it. This was first done, well, actually, no, not first done with the human genome, but the human genome was first sequenced at the turn of the century, and it took 13 years and some... Wow. Yeah,
That's cool.
billions of dollars to do, whereas, so 13 years and so many people involved, and they had to, really, really slowly read through these little things, and it must have been so boring.
Crazy, yeah.
Actually, well, random anecdote.
Yeah, go on.
I was, I had knee surgery last year and this year because I can't get enough of it.
You got two knees, didn't it?
My right knee was feeling left out. So the anaesthetist was telling me that he did a placement whilst they were discovering the human genome, and I was like, that's so interesting. I was like, that's so cool. And so we were chatting about biology.
That is really cool.
Yeah, it would have been such a momentous thing. I remember reading about it in my biology textbook at school. But anyway, so that was like a major project, and we learned a lot about DNA sequencing. And since then, just like with computers, the technology is, got quicker and quicker and cheaper. So now you can do whole genome sequencing in like a day, and it costs a lot less.
Yeah.
So I think you can sequence an entire human genome now in less than 24 hours and for around about £5,000 or something.
That's pretty cool. That also reminds me, I met a man whose PhD project was doing an internet search, and that was it. And he got a doctorate, for literally doing a search on the internet. I'm not sure what
all the doctorates now.
And now it literally takes, fractions of a second to do one vastly better. But at the time, it's groundbreaking.
Yeah. But the point I was going to make before I got very distracted was that once we started being able to read an organism's DNA, its blueprint, and sorry, if you're not familiar with what DNA actually is, it's the blueprint for your phenotype, which is your appearance and the things you have, the
structure.
Yeah, the proteins you have, and whether your hair color is red like mine obviously naturally is, or if you've got blue eyes, brown eyes, whatever. All of these things are genetically coded for. It's a blueprint, but So if you actually look at the DNA, you can look for similarities and differences. And by doing that, scientists learned a lot about species that we thought were more closely related based on their morphology, their appearance. So, both these organisms have got tusks, therefore they must be closely related. But actually, it turned out that they both independently evolved tusks.
Which is, that's one of my favourite things about evolution, is things like flight independently evolved like 3 or 4 times, which shows that how much a beneficial trait it is to have, and how it's been solved, like how nature has kind of like solved that problem in very different ways to get the same effect. And you might look at some things and say they must be related because they have the same property, they look the same, and they're just like totally unrelated. And also similarly, I guess the other way around, you could think 2 things were unrelated because they look so different. Like, I recently found out that moles and bats are quite closely related, and I think that's quite poppy for this thing. I think that's quite cool because you wouldn't necessarily think about it, but when someone says that, you're like, oh, I guess I can see that, because they're both like little cute little snouty things. And there's just one more thing I want to squeeze in on this because it's really interesting and it's probably completely unrelated, but I can't remember the word for it, but when you have a virus, it can insert some of its DNA into yours.
Retrovirus.
So, and then your cells can end up reproducing your DNA, but with this chunk of virus in it. And sometimes it's completely harmless. It just doesn't do anything.
Oh, we got a ton of them in our DNA.
Yeah, and you can actually trace like which species are related by looking at this random stuff, because the chance of a random virus inserting a certain pattern into a certain place in your DNA is like, 1 in billions and billions. So if you look and you're like, oh, well, look, all of the great apes have this same one in the same place, the same thing that does nothing, that shows that it must have happened, this insertion must have happened to the common ancestor of all of us, because the chance of that happening by fluke is just impossible, which is really interesting for like tracking, where these species have come from, which I just think is really cool.
There's so many points I want to make.
Oh, do it.
But there's one thing about having a blueprint and the finished product, but I think that might be better. I'll bring up in a minute.
Okay.
But you mentioned viruses. So my biology background is actually on plant pathology, so looking at plant diseases, plant viruses particularly. So it's one of my favourite topics.
Oh God!
Not immediately relevant today until you brought it up. So there's some really, really cool stuff that viruses can do to us. One of my favourite topics is called the host manipulation hypothesis.
Okay.
Have I told you about this?
No, go for it. It's really
So
interesting.
it's well characterised by a famous fungal disease of ants.
Oh yeah, okay, I know about this. If it's to do with ants, I know about it.
Can you remember the name
ants.
of it?
No, but I'm going to recognise it.
Well, I've forgotten the name.
Oh, no, okay.
So I was like, can you remember the trick question? Begins with the C. It'll come to me later.
Yes, okay.
When I'm at home, probably tonight. But anyway, it's this fungus that once it infects the ants, it infects their brain and it changes their actual behaviour. So it makes them want to climb really high, clamp on with their appendages, and then this fungus will take over, and the point is that they've climbed to really cordyceps, that's the one. They've climbed to a really high spot so that the fungal spores can spread really far, because once you're higher up, the wind can catch and you can go much further. So it's basically the disease.
Oh no, don't push the microphone. God, come on.
It's probably like a real cat, like. It's the disease, the pathogen, the bug responsible for causing the disease, like COVID, or the virus, the coronavirus, actually is called in COVID, will actually make changes in its host to benefit the virus.
Yeah.
So there's a certain species of plant virus that is transmitted by aphids, which are little green flies. A lot like we can get malaria from mosquitoes.
Favourites.
Another one of your favourites.
I love aphids. When we get on to like the sex differentiation, I've got an aphid. I'm cracking out some aphid facts.
So this virus is carried by aphids, much like malaria is carried by mosquitoes, but the actual host is, malaria is for humans, and this virus is for plants, and the aphids feed on the plants, and so it's a good way to kind of get the virus from one host to another. And what this does is once the aphids actually eat this virus, ingest the sap that contains the virus, they go from having no wings to having wings, so that it benefits the virus because the carrier can transport that virus way further if you've got wings than if you're stuck on a plant.
So, right, I'm cracking my aphid down because that tags into it. But so aphids have really cool reproduction strategies. So they've like there's different species of aphids, and they have different ones. But there are some aphids which can reproduce both sexually and asexually, and they can also lay eggs and give live birth. And there are ones that can give birth to pregnant aphids, which are already like developing another aphid inside them when they are created, which is mad. And the reason and then also another thing is they can give birth to aphids that do have wings or don't have wings. And so basically the strategy is an aphid with wings will fly and it will land on a plant, and it might be the only one that shows up, and it wants to just fill this plant, like get as many out as it can. So it gives as much, it lays loads of eggs, it creates loads of just clones of itself as fast as it possibly can. But they don't have wings because they're landing on a new plant. So growing wings obviously uses loads of energy. It makes you more of a target and things. So all of the first and few generations will be born without wings, and they'll grow as quickly as they can and then just create more clones of themselves. And then when some other aphids turn up, then they can start exchanging genetic material to make the local population more diverse. And then as the plant starts filling up and it starts getting cramped again, they start being born with wings again, so they can then fly. So it's really interesting that the virus can like force that, because that's obviously a switch that they have, that they've evolved to benefit themselves, and then the virus is like hijacked it,
Exactly,
which is really cool. Aphids are really cool.
Viruses are really cool.
Yeah.
So viruses are especially cool because they're really teeny tiny. They don't even exist in cells. The only way they can actually reproduce is by hijacking a host machinery. There's so many cool things. Probably another episode's worth.
Yeah, we'll come on to it.
But that brings me on to a point about, you said there's a switch. So you can get winged morphs and non-winged morphs of aphids, but they've all got the fundamental potential to have wings or to not have wings.
They have that in the DNA.
They have it in the DNA. And especially if they're clones, they'll all have identical DNA. And so what it is that there are certain genes, they're actually called transcription factors, if you're interested, which are sort of like these master switches that will cause a kind of chain of events to happen. So a bit like when you turn on the electricity to the house, you can switch on a light switch, you can have the light on in one room but off in another. But if you don't have the electricity connected to that house, you can't turn any of them on. So transcription factors are a bit like that. They will allow loads of we call them downstream events to happen to then switch things on and off. And so a really fundamental concept of biology is that just because you have the blueprint, just because you have the code, doesn't mean you will, we say, express that gene, that code. Just because you have the DNA for blue eyes, you might actually end up with brown eyes because, perhaps your other set of chromosomes has that gene and that one's expressed. And that's why...
I think it's a really good setup for the next point. So I guess, do we have
Segue.
Anything more on... Yeah, very good. Do we have anything more on human, I guess, is the...
I think it kind of just the take home being this, it's a human-made concept that we put organisms into these boxes. Yeah, like what a species is. Obviously, it does have characteristics which are biological, but this is all kind of human put on, and they're dynamic. They're ever evolving, changing. Some are in the process of speciation. Some are diverging.
In a sense, like everything is evolving all the time, and so everything is in the process of potentially speciating. like, how could you say this one is and this one isn't? Like, it's very difficult to.
Well,
if
there
there's
are
environmental pressure, or unless you've got.
There are like biological procedures that you can apply to see which ones are more likely to be diverging and which ones are not, and a lot of it will depend on whether they are sexually reproducing or not. Because you mentioned it earlier, a really good strategy sometimes, if, you know, perhaps you live in a really extreme environment, you're not likely to come across another member of your species for a long time. Well, it'd be a really poor evolutionary strategy if you just stay and, okay, well, there's no one to reproduce with, so I'll just die.
Pandas.
But a lot of species have got the ability to reproduce asexually. So without any partners, they'll just clonally kind of reproduce. They'll produce offspring which are genetically identical, or at least half genetically identical, you know, with all sorts of different examples and different kind of variations of it. Thank you, Poppy. You got a question. And so, thank you, Poppy.
You can claim yourself in order.
Oh yeah. So obviously, when you're in a really extreme environment, and you know maybe there's not very many resources, or certainly no members of your species around, it makes a lot of sense to reproduce asexually and just clone. But it's a great short-term strategy, but in the long term, it's a poor strategy because you have no diversity in your gene pool, and so you've got no sort of potential to adapt to new situations. You're completely reliant on the diversity in your genome coming from novel mutation events. This is a whole other biology lesson in itself.
We'll stay clear of that because that sounds really interesting and we can do it some other time.
Basically, if you only reproduce asexually, you're not going to last very many millennia.
Which, you know, is something we should all be thinking about. So I guess the last word in this is female, which is probably the biggest topic. So we've actually been talking for 45 minutes already. But I think we can come on to this for a bit and then we can just perhaps broach over them, and maybe we'll do another part 2 if people are interested.
Definitely have lots more to say.
Yeah. Well, we'll take some. So we'll talk for 15 or 20 minutes about the definition of sex and male and female. Which might not cover all of it, and
it definitely won't.
We'll take some questions, and then perhaps we'll come back for a dedicated part 2 just about male and female, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, I'd love to. Okay. Yeah.
And also, if you want to do a 20-minute thing, I would just don't want to give half information and leave it hanging. But there's so much in biology. I mean, this is all just scraping the surface.
Well, perhaps a really good focus for the next 15 minutes then would be to talk about the genetic determination of sex. Obviously, sex. I'm sure most of you watchers out there will know sex and gender are 2 different things.
Well, yeah, it's interesting because sex and gender are the same thing in a lot of contexts and different things in other contexts. Sex and gender are totally interchangeable words for a lot of things, and often in law they'll use those 2 words interchangeably in some places and not in other places, and it can cause a whole kind of mess. And you know, lots of times you'll see single gender facilities, single sex facilities, and to most people who aren't biologists, who aren't obsessed with trans people, that just they read it as the same word, and it literally means no different. But yeah, so I think sorry.
I was going to say, a big argument that people who anti-trans come up with is that it's your biology, sex and gender are the same thing, so how can you change one and not the other? Well, sex determination firstly can happen through loads of different ways. So we've got genetic determination of sex. I guess it's worth just very briefly mentioning that so many organisms who also have sexual dimorphism, who have males and females, have different ways of determining their sex. So there's really famous example is a type of fish called a cleaner wrasse or something, which they undergo sexual differentiation according to social factors. So they tend to live in groups, and they'll mostly females, and the biggest fish will become the male and will kind of, rule the roost a bit. If they die or go off, then the next biggest female will then become a male. So it's not a really clear-cut way of even gender determining. And that's even true when you're genetically determined. Not all organisms have this binary setup of...
Well, this is a contentious point. So,
well, that's a fact.
Yeah. Oh, well, no. So I guess what I was going to say is that when we're talking about sex here, there's different contexts at which we're talking about sex for. So there's like the legal concept, and there's like the sort of social concept, and there's the kind of the biological concept, which is similar to the last two. I mean, particularly with adult. So in law, they'll often create. Most countries have male and female as legal categories, and you have to be one or the other.
Have to put M or F on your birth certificate.
And that's the only option. And there are actually quite a few places now which also have X, which you can either choose once you become an adult, and some places the doctors can actually decide X for you at birth, which is a point of debate. But so that's the legal system, and also the social system certainly for like Western culture, like in the UK, is very much, for most people, though I guess it's kind of changing. There's just two boxes, like, are you a boy or a girl? That's the question that people ask.
And that people tend to, that kind of outlook is judged on the outwardly presenting.
It can be, and depending on who you ask, I guess that if you like meet some random person on the street, that's probably how they're going to judge you. Trans people might argue that your presentation isn't actually important in.
Well, it's not.
Yes. Anyway, but
if you're of that mindset of like, there are only two boxes. You look like a man. You look like a female.
Yeah.
Those are the only two possibilities.
And what you often find with people with that kind of view, that there's this really classic like trans meme where they'll see you and they'll like a classic thing is they'll see you and they'll be like, oh, this person looks like a man who's very feminine. They'll be like, oh, you look like a girl, and they're like, oh, thank you, and then they're like, oh, well, in that case you look like a man. And it's just so dumb because like there's this kind of purity test on both. So if you say, well, I'm a woman, they're like, oh, you don't look like a woman, you must be a man. It's an insult. And if you say, well, I'm a man, they'll be like, oh, you don't look like a man. And it's like this purity test for both of them. You must be this manly, you must be this like womanly. But then also they say it's a binary because they also don't like the idea of non-binary people. Anyway, that's kind of a sidetrack. So what I was going to say on the biology point is, when we're saying what the sex of an animal is, there's lots of different components to that. So there's obviously if you want to reproduce, if you're like a farmer and you're trying to reproduce, trying to make pigs in order to make lots of bacon or whatever, go vegan.
Baby bacon.
If you do that, then obviously you want like the ones that are going to be able to reproduce. So you need to know which are like fertile males and fertile females, and they're the only ones that are going to produce like piglets. And in that case, if you're labeling which ones are male and female, the ones you're interested in are obviously, in most cases, you're going to look at their genitals, and from that you can assume what their chromosomes are, you can assume what gametes that they're probably going to be able to produce or what they already have. You can make all these other kind of assumptions because it's usually true. But when you're, like, as a biologist, say, like dissecting an animal, there are all these different components, which I've just said about, which, potentially you can label each of these components individually as male or female.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, that it spans beyond animals. Plants, everyone's usually familiar with a flower, and you get taught in school which bits are the male bits, which bits are the female bits, and often a flower is a bisexual structure. It's got both male bits and female bits.
It fancies men and women.
Yeah, it's like the male bits produce the pollen and the female bits have the eggs and the ovum, and there's this whole process of, exchanging genetic material between different individuals. And so that for that individual, it's neither male nor female, it's got both male and female bits in its flower.
And so when you were looking, as if you were looking at like a random plant cell, like there were some cells which I would show you, and it's I can't remember all the words. We were talking about this just before we started. There are some parts which is like the male gamete of a plant, and there are and I could show you this, and you could be like, oh well, I would call that a male cell.
Yeah.
And there are some plant cells which you'd say this is a female cell, and then there will be some plant cells which it doesn't make sense to label the male or female because.
Yeah.
But there are also
like
some
a bit of stem or a bit of leaf.
Yeah,
is that male or female? Well, I don't know.
Well, yeah, but so there are some plants we were talking about before, like asparagus, which the whole plant can have like you could sex.
Yeah. So plants are a funny one anyway. They've got a really peculiar life cycle, which I won't go into because I'll probably bore you. My students, they have to endure this, so I won't subject you to it too. But basically, plants can, as Katie said, you can have whole individuals that are male or female, and that's existed actually through evolutionary time, quite a long time. You can get whole trees. A ginkgo, for example, is what we call dioecious. It's got this segregation of different morphs, different, sexual differentiation. A whole tree, a whole organism can be male or female, not just the parts of the flower. And also you can get male or female flowers on the same plant. You can get male flowers just on one plant, female flowers on just on the other plant.
How you're classing them as male or female is that you're looking at the okay, Poppy. So for like plants which have some flowers have both parts in them, and you can look because you're saying which the two types of gametes or whatever, and then there are some flowers where the plant has both types of flowers, and then there are some plants which only have like one type of flower. But if you were just given a totally new plant and you looked at its like you had access to genetic information, but it was say like fossilized, so it wasn't about to grow a flower. You had no information about its reproductive strategy. Could you know if it was like asparagus where it would only produce one type of flower, or it's like a pumpkin where it could produce both types, or it's like a thing where it produces a double type?
Yeah, you could, if you were able to look at the genetics, it would be quite difficult if you literally just found a fossil, because you kind of need things to compare it to, and you need to kind of do a bit of breeding usually to kind of look at where the differences are. But asparagus is an example where it has evolved sex chromosomes. So humans, for example, we have typically 46 chromosomes in each and every cell. And they're split into pairs. So we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. 22 of those pairs are what we call the autosomes, which are basically just non-sex chromosomes. And there's one set, which in one set in humans, which is called the sex chromosomes, and they're composed of an X and a Y. If you have typically an X and a Y, you tend to be male. If you have two X's, you tend to be female. But that's not that's a common thing in mammals, but it's not common across all organisms, all sexual organisms. Many organisms are hermaphrodite and have both parts. Many, one thing I wanted to bring up was, for example, fungi, you actually end up with hundreds or even thousands of mating types. You don't just have a binary set. They actually have loads of different sexes, essentially, that, either can or can't mate with each other. So it gets incredibly complex. There's often not just kind of, it's either an X and a Y or whatever. Often there can be more chromosomes involved in the sex determination. And the thing about asparagus, I feel like that's the catchphrase now, is that it's evolved sex chromosomes fairly recently in terms of evolutionary time. And it's got something that is quite unusual in that it's got an X and an X, which would be female, an X and a Y, that would be male, and then it's got a Y and a Y, that's it's called a super male.
Well, I mean, that's really interesting, because if you are looking at mating types, if you're just looking at like the gametes, you would say they're a male and female. But then if you're looking at the chromosomes, in this case, it's interesting because it's different to many, like it was different to humans at least. in that it kind of has these three typical combinations. So for example, in humans, the typical combinations are either XX or XY, and there are all kinds of other combinations. You can just be X, or you can be XXY, and there's and you can also be XXXY chimera. And there's all kinds of
there's so many.
And what's I think interesting with regards to the general topic of this kind of adult human female discussion is if you pick one thing and you say, it's based on like the gametes, then that doesn't necessarily give you the information about other parts. So if do you want to go?
And the whole process of sexual determination is something that has come up in the past. So, with the Olympics.
So this is the thing right now in the news.
Oh, wow. It's something that in the past, so like the 1996 Olympics in Atlanta, the officials wanted to kind of verify people's sex or gender, because there was a bit of a culture at the time of taking, hormones and stuff to kind of make you build muscle and so on, sort of
cheating.
Yeah. So they brought this in to try to combat that. And there's a really interesting fact, actually. They tested for a particular gene that is present on the Y chromosome called the SRY.
So I always say
SY for?
Sex something region.
Sex determining region Y.
Oh, okay, because I always think it's determining, that's a D.
Yeah, I know. It's like, we're just not going to count the D.
Wait.
Penis. So that's that SRY gene is actually a type of transcription factor, which is what I mentioned before, which is a bit like turning on or off the electricity. So in human males, if you have this gene, often it means that you've got the capability to then switch on the electricity to your house. And so then...
That sounds really sexist. Sorry, love, you've got the right chromosomes.
So, imagine if each room in the house was a different kind of male characteristic. So in one room you've got the penis room. Yeah. In one room you've got the balls room. Yeah. The other room you've got the...
what horrible room.
And another you've got a deep voice. You've got all of these traits that, are associated with being male or being female. But just because you turn the electricity onto the whole house doesn't mean that all of those rooms are going to switch on or off, because one of the rooms might be missing a light bulb.
And I think what's interesting about the sports example you said, obviously if you come at this with like the sort of what you would learn in school, where you say, well, everything's either male or female, we just want a test in order to say which one's which. So in case anyone's, for whatever reason. So we test all these people and we say to like someone, well, what's the way of testing these? And we're like, you could look for the SRY gene. And then that works most of the time. And then sometimes there are some people who are women in the sense that if you met them, you would think they're a woman and they would say they're a woman. They could be women in the sense that they've been pregnant and given birth. And they could be women in every single sense.
Tick all the boxes, adult, human, female.
Exactly, ticking all the boxes.
Menstruate, all those things.
But they could also have an SRY gene or even a Y chromosome, which means that if you're doing these genetic tests for, say, sports, there's most of the time it's probably going to work, but then you might get one contentious one where some random woman who's grown up and just lived her normal life, and they're like, oh, sorry, you're a man.
Well, so at the Atlanta Olympics in 1996, they did this test for the presence of the SRY gene in women, and they tested 3,000 women, and of those 8 were positive for the SRY gene, but they would never,
none of them
consider that they would be men, and so then
But they're not men. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway,
and so they might have the ability to switch on the electricity to the house, but there might be all sorts of reasons why that doesn't result in what we would typically call a man, because one of the major developmental points in human development and in a fetus and your a tiny baby inside the womb is basically we all start out as female. That's the default. Yeah. So, and at some
what
point,
went wrong?
and at a certain stage in this development, the SRY gene snaps in, switches on, and it makes all these kind of chain reactions and changes that will then turn on other genes, which, by the way, aren't on the Y chromosome. They're on loads of different chromosomes, that's so not just the Y.
An interesting fact that I'll be able to add is that the X chromosomes contain like most of the information, compared to a Y chromosome, which is really small, and all it really does is like patches over a few decisions.
Oh, it's so interesting. The Y chromosome is really stunted and degenerated. Like, it's literally it's getting smaller and smaller. It's losing functionality for a very good biological reason, which I won't go into because we don't have time. But
we'll do next episode. Yeah, next episode. But anyway, so I guess the point that I was kind of steering towards here is that you could say, oh, well, male is someone with an SRY gene, or you could say male is someone who produces sperm, or you could say male is someone with like a penis at birth, and like most of the time all those three things will get you to the same answer, but they won't always get you to the same answer. And when you have created these like binary boxes, if you start saying if one scientist, so if you said, oh well, I'm going to do it on gametes because that's how people reproduce, and that's kind of like what the point in sex in plants is. So the only reason we describe them is whether they can reproduce or not. And someone else says, well, I'm going to do it on chromosomes because I'm testing for sport in Atlanta 1996. Then your two definitions functionally are very similar and pretty much have the same outcome. But in this, even in the Atlanta Olympics, if they had picked the gamete definition, it would have given a different answer. And
it's different still if you look at something like hormone levels, which is really important in the development. The SRY gene will switch on things like testosterone production, which will then lead to the formation of male characteristics like genitalia and so on. But I keep going back to this probably awful analogy with electricity in the house. But if you have if you have a missing light bulb in one of those rooms, that's analogous to having, okay, so you might be able to produce testosterone, but perhaps you're not sensitive to it. So you can't perceive the fact that your body is full of testosterone. So that's another way in which, okay, so let's just see who's got the level of testosterone. But actually that's completely meaningless because it's completely dependent on whether you are receptive to it or not. And it's like being diabetic and not being receptive to insulin, type 1 diabetes.
So I guess one of the points that I regularly make in battles online is that...
Or type 2, actually, I think I got it wrong.
Okay. Is that people often present it as... Well, in a binary is inherently one-dimensional, which means, it's like it's here or it's here. There's only this one movement. There's only two places for it. But even if you were to say, like, oh, it's a range of values, that's not true. It's that it's multi-dimensional. I usually say n-dimensional because we don't know how many dimensions there are. Well, I don't know how many dimensions there are. Perhaps it's something that biologists could define potentially.
We're definitely still learning. But the fact is with science is there's so much that we don't know. And the more we learn, the more we realise we don't know. Yeah. So to say that it is, rigid and one-dimensional is just not the case.
I think we can say that it's clearly false, that it's one-dimensional because already we've had these two examples where they come up with different answers, but there's a case where you're telling a woman who's potentially like given birth and breastfed a child that
not that those are necessarily make you more or less female than someone who doesn't do that.
If you say to someone, it could just be, potentially you, for all you know, could be XY if you've not been sequenced, and like. In the case of, if we were talking about just about chromosomes and like we were biologists discussing chromosomes, we could say, in this case, Rose is male because she has male chromosomes, and in the context of biology, that would be like it's just a fact. It's just like you would have male chromosomes.
Well, actually, it wouldn't be because yes, I would have the chromosomes, but if I did.
The rest of it.
Obviously my body hasn't responded to the fact that I have that gene.
So, but if, like, we're talking about chromosomes, like, say, you have male chromosomes, but obviously you're a woman, and there's probably loads of other interesting things going on. But if we were to just class people by chromosomes, that would obviously be nonsense. And it's similar for, like, kind of all the parts. But that's why this kind of n-dimensional thing, because it's interesting, because if you want to pick one specific thing, then you can define them to a degree and say whether most people are that, like, oh, you have a Y chromosome or you don't, is fairly easy to determine, but that doesn't really say the full picture of the person, I guess, is what you're saying with this, like, your light switch thing. Like, the switch on the road is on, I'm not really sure, but, like, we don't.
I always do this when I'm teaching, like, something will just pop into my head and I'll run with it for the whole lecture, and they're like, what are you talking about? Just like, going on about
plant virology is a little bit like skateboarding.
Literally, it just pops into my head. I'm like, and so in this analogy, you're doing your Tony Hawk.
And Tony Hawk, you see, he has an excellent but,
basically, the take home is, if you're trying to argue that, trans isn't a thing or whatever, and you're saying, well, because it's biology, it's science, that it doesn't stand up. There's so many exceptions. It's such a dynamic, subject. There are so many variances, and sex and gender are two very different concepts. And even if your genes say you are one thing, one sex, gender is obviously a social.
Yeah. Well, I think this is like another kind of whole topic, I guess, is that the point that I would make is that something like your chromosomes have affected your life a lot in one sense, but in another sense, don't affect your life at all. Like, your chromosomes today, they don't determine what kind of sexism you face. They don't determine who finds you attractive. They don't determine how people interact with you in society. Like, they've contributed to the history of how you've got to here today massively, but they're not, like, the determiner. And so therefore categorizing people that way is kind of nonsense. And I think that the first, like, part of the discussion needs to be recognizing that it's multidimensional, and then also that it's like there's more combinations than just two. It's not like, some of the dimensions are arguably binary, but lots of them aren't at all.
And there's so many good examples across biology where sex chromosomes are not the be all and end all of sex determination. They can appear, they can disappear. I said the Y chromosome is basically degenerating. It keeps making me think of Degeneration X. You ever watch wrestling? Degeneration X. They do that thing. It should be called Degeneration Y because it's degenerating. Anyway, it's like the Y chromosome is getting smaller and smaller, and it's losing its functionality gradually. And eventually, probably what will happen is that the SRY gene will jump onto a different chromosome and we'll lose the Y chromosome altogether. There's actually some predictions that it will happen in, let me just get this right,
December 2024.
4.6 million years.
Okay. Oh, I guess that's the rate of change.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really interesting. But I think that so I guess maybe a bit I missed out from the very start of this discussion, just to kind of bring it back, is that often in the context of trans rights, the reason that people just bring up this adult human female definition, and especially the female part, is kind of attempting to have a scientific justification for opposing, like, trans rights. And the argument that I usually make...
and their existence.
Yeah, and there's two levels to this argument I make. In one sense, it literally doesn't matter if someone is male or female if we recognise the fact that at least some trans women, maybe most, but at least some, face misogynistic sexism for being women. So any legal protections we have in place need to, like, take that into account. And we're not trying to say that trans women and cis women are the same biologically or anything like that, but to claim that the only reason we categorize people is by biology is kind of nonsense. You're not saying this room here is for people who have XX chromosomes. You're saying this room here is for women because there's sexism as a force in society, and having a separate room for them can be beneficial in certain contexts. So the first level is the attempt to make this a biology argument is kind of a fallacy, because that demonstrably that isn't the key factor. But also then on top of that, stepping into the biology, the kind of adult human female, question answered, doesn't matter, like you're a male, problem solved, is that even that is really complex, and often that ends up stamping on all kinds of other people. I mean, it often ends up stamping on intersex people, and it can, some of the people I end up arguing with online, they'll say like, oh, you're not a woman unless you have a period or something. And like some of my cis women friends who aren't intersex don't have periods, and it's just such a garbage thing to say. It's so pointless.
And I don't know why people always think they know much more about. You brought up an example of a man saying, well, I know that you're not women unless you do this, that, and the other.
Oh yeah, there was a good tweet the other day where someone was talking about how women get sexually aroused and their boobs double in volume.
Volume, double.
Like, hey.
Can you imagine that? Like, and that the fact that you'd never really witnessed this happen and didn't lead to question that.
When you watch enough anime, you've seen it happen.
But the point I wanted to make as a cis woman, I obviously we all have our own levels of privilege, right? So I come from a certain level of privilege where I haven't experienced transphobic comments and stuff in my...
There's some cis women do.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm not saying I represent all cis women or anything like that, but personally, my experience, I think it... And also as an ardent feminist, I strongly advocate for equal rights and equal opportunities for all, no matter what your outward appearance is. So, skin colour, hair colour, genitalia, whatever that may be. And we should all try to be more supportive of each other. Why turn around and stamp on a certain group of people and say, oh no, you shouldn't be given the same rights as, such and such, because of some arbitrary reason that you've come up with or that you believe is based on science. Why isn't everyone just, you should support each other and lend a hand to each other and be compassionate. Why does it matter to you what gender someone identifies as?
I think for a lot of people, this is probably another discussion on its own as well. I think for a lot of people, it's the belief inside that they're a good person, that they are compassionate and that they're empathetic, also combined with their disgust, dislike, aversion to trans people. And they'll be like, well, it can't be that I'm being irrational here. It can't be just a dumb gut reaction. It has to be rational. So they go looking for a rationalization, and a good place to look is in biology or in the dictionary, which is where most people turn. Oh, adult human female, that's like problem solved. So that means I'm not compassionate. It's not that I don't dislike trans people. I love trans. Some of my best friends are trans people. It's just that I think, for some reason, that we should sort people in changing rooms by their gametes. And because science, it's not my opinion. It's not me being irrational, but it's because...
and that's fueled by so many misconceptions and misinformation.
It's all kind of garbage, but it's based on... Yeah, it's an attempt to rationalise it. But I think, anyway, so we've been going for over an hour, and we've covered those three words to a degree, and I think we've explained, or the main message I guess I want to communicate is that biology is really messy, really complicated, and it's just like it's a human construct, our understanding of it placed on top of the facts in front of us, and none of those words are actually straightforward. And I quite enjoy when people are saying, they crack out the definition. I'm like, can you just define those three words for me? And just do adult, just do adult, and that alone is a huge topic.
It's really difficult.
Yeah. So I would like to say, does anyone have any questions? if you do, can you tag me in on the chat? I haven't actually been watching the chat, so it's probably like full of trolls. But
we'll also say thanks for listening if you've made it this far.
Yeah, thank you very much for tuning in so far. But yeah, let's just see.
And apologies in advance if I've said anything insensitive. So yeah.
You can cancel me on Rose's behalf if that's happened.
I didn't even know what cancelled meant earlier.
Oh yeah,
Katie had to explain it to me.
She thought that I was saying cancelled in a really London accent. You go down to cancel me.
Cancelled? What do you mean, Katie?
So I think that it's very like this adult human female thing has kind of become a dog whistle, because if a dog whistle is where you say something which doesn't literally say your position. It's just something that everyone who holds your position says. So you signal to each other. The classic example, like where it comes from, is in America when they were trying to enact racist policies, but they couldn't be explicitly racist because it would tank their PR. So they talked about states' rights, and like a state should have their own right to decide these policies, and that ended up being the battle over states' rights, but the rights were the state's right to be racist. So states' rights became a dog whistle, and really, if you take it literally, the rights of an individual state, like, okay, who cares? But everyone who knows what that dog whistle means knows what it means, and they can argue for it. And I think that adult human female has become a dog whistle, which is kind of dumb, because I think for a lot of people who aren't online all the time, like if you went into the toilet and it said, someone had graffitied on the wall, a woman is an adult human female, you'd be like, yeah. And I think that most trans women would be, they would go into the women's toilets, which they've been legally doing since 2010 and beyond. And
why are anti-trans people so obsessed with toilets and genitalia?
They love toilets.
It's so weird.
But anyway, if I didn't live on Twitter, I'd go into the toilet and someone was like that, and I'd be like, yeah, that's me. Like, that's not a problem. I mean, I know that my chromosomes are most likely XY. I don't know that for certain, but it's probably...
I would say you definitely will have a Y, because otherwise you wouldn't have been able to exhibit...
You can get XX males.
So perhaps... But you tend to get XX if the part of the Y has translocated onto
yes, so
the X.
You can get an SRY gene on an X chromosome.
So that's also a possibility.
It's possible, but
you probably do have the SRY gene.
Yeah, I mean, but the thing is that has obviously affected my history quite significantly, but that isn't like an interesting feature of me, I guess. I don't know. It's certainly not the defining.
It doesn't tell you who you actually are, because as we've explored, your genetics. I like to kind of think of it like you have a blueprint for building a house. You'll have a design and a set of instructions. But what it actually turns out like might look very different from the blueprint. And that's because of a whole host of environmental factors. You know, perhaps you'll have a certain type of cement which will make it look a different colour. Maybe you'll make a mistake along the way. I think the wall or something. But the blueprint doesn't, I actually made up a little meme for one of my lectures. We're talking about genetics and the basics of it, and talking about how essentially if you are XX, you will carry a lot of the genes responsible for encoding male features, but it's just that, main switch. A few other things as well. It's quite as simple as that actually, but the point is we all have this blueprint, and just because we have the blueprint doesn't mean we express it. Annoying.
What are you doing?
I had this little tagline that was like, it's not what you have, it's how you express it.
Which is interesting. So I was just looking. Currently, we didn't have any questions. If anyone wants to ask a question.
I think there was a question, but I don't know if it was like a question. Sorry, I was in suspense.
The point I was going to go for, so we can come back to the question, is saying about expressing it, which is something we haven't covered at all, which is hormones being a massive factor, maybe the largest factor in gene expression. So there are some. So for example, we can say that
one of
the main ones. Anyway. Yeah. I think a good example is that typically male humans don't grow breasts and female humans do, but we all have the genetic code for that, and the hormones turn on this switch. So if you're someone who is male in literally every sense, if you're a cis man and you also are XY and you also create sperm and all, you tick all those boxes, if you were to switch to having estrogen as your main sex hormone, then you would almost certainly grow breasts, and you would even eventually be able to lactate, and that's because different genes get turned on and off by hormones. So you can have a situation where you can have like the blueprint of like your sex chromosomes, and sometimes genes turn other genes on and off. Like in the case with the Y chromosome turns off some things and turns on some other things, however it works. But then also in your life, hormones can change it. I mean, there are so many things can change it. Stress can change it. Your diet can change it.
Yeah, that's a whole really cool area of biology.
Lots of people often, like, a very common thing is you can't change your biology. You can't change your DNA. But that's just straight up objectively false. You can change your biology. I mean, you change your biology by eating too much food. Like, you change your biology.
Stress and UV light. All these things can destroy your DNA. Like a vampire. All these things can destroy your DNA, but you can also change the expression of your DNA by your environmental surroundings. And one of those methods of altering the expression of your genes is can be the way in which the way in which your DNA is packaged. So in this picture behind, it's a chromosome. Ignore the kind of double helix in the middle, because that's not how it would actually appear. But your DNA is condensed and packaged into chromosomes, and it's packaged up with proteins that keep it all together. And when you want to express a gene, what your cells have to do is unpackage this, big bundle of stuff to expose the code and to allow the cell to do what it does and express that gene. But there can be some mechanisms where there's certain packaging of that, and you can call it methylation. It's a form of epigenetics where those can be heritable changes. So if I were to have children, I could potentially pass on changes as a direct result of my lifestyle.
So the classic one of these is extreme stress can cause behavioural changes via like epigenetics, your actual DNA changing, or however it is, your gene expression changing from like extreme stress, like which you can then pass on to your children. And I think an example that I've read about before, which I'm certainly not an expert on, but is worth researching, is people who survived the Holocaust have survived such extreme stress, and the extreme stress changed their biology through epigenetics. And their gene expression, which they then pass on to their children, and their children pass on, and it's something you can actually measure, which is that's quite incredible. But I guess that's kind of another topic. But I guess the point here that I'm making is that your gene expression is in a sense more important than what genes you have, because Definitely. If you have 10 genes, and I have 10 genes, and 9 of nine of them are different, and we have one the same, but those 9 are off in both of us, then it doesn't matter that they're different at all. And if I've got one of my genes is on, and then I take a hormone and that gets turned off and a different one gets turned on, I mean, this is super dumbed down, but then that, the history of me having that one on might be important, or it might not. And this gene might not have been on, trans people often have situations where, most male people have this gene off, and most female people have this gene on, and then a trans person sort of changes from one to the other, and that involves turning that gene on through hormones.
Yeah.
And then the sort of expression of that gene and what that results in is actually kind of the important bit. And whether you're you originally expressed it or not is less important. I mean, it's important in a historical context, but not in a right now context.
Well, also, the most important thing is how you feel as a person. No one can ever say, "Oh, you should be this way," because I think you should be this way. You can never look into someone's mind or experience and say you should be a certain way. The only person who can tell you that is the person themselves. Just like you can never look at a relationship between two people and say, oh, well, you should do that. So no, because every relationship is different, everyone's experience is different. And so you have to give credit and trust into those experiences and respect that.
And it just happens from the evidence that we have from the last decade of having, for example, this is the thing that people are most stressed about is things like with crime. Generally, people don't say they aren't who they are. Most people will tell you who they are, which is why the crime statistics didn't change when they switched over to asking people rather than telling them who they are. Anyway, well, let's just check. We've got at least one question here. Why is it? So this is from Laura. Why is it that people don't have a problem sexuality being on a gay to straight spectrum, and expression being everything from girly to tomboy, but sex must be binary? Gosh, that's an interesting question.
I suppose some people do have that same view on sexuality.
Absolutely, yeah.
And there's probably...
And presentation. I think that in one sense, like the sort of traditional conservative view from 2,000 years ago or whatever, is that there's only one sexuality and that's straight. There's only one presentation for whether you're a boy or a girl, and there's either boy or girl, and it's like very set in the ways. And then as things start breaking down, because that's kind of bullshit, like, oh, actually, men and women can wear whatever they want. Actually, men and women can be attracted to whoever they want. And actually, people can express themselves and biologically change themselves in like any way they want within reason. But I think that in that sense, transphobia is kind of often, 99% of the time, recycled homophobia, and it's often recycled just like the patriarchy. You get similar things. You get these similar themes of people who today are stressed about trans people, and they're using all the same arguments that people who are stressed about gay people were 30 years ago, who are making all the same arguments who are people who are stressed about women wearing trousers in the Victorian times. And
like some of those arguments against women, the sexism, the perpetration of the patriarchy, some of those arguments going back are absolutely laughable today. That women too emotional to be able to vote. Like, what?
Talking about earlier, it's like n-dimensional. There's loads of different directions. Like, there isn't just like there isn't just male presentation and female presentation, and you can pick a point on the line. There's like all different kinds of things that you can do, and like with like transition, there isn't like someone isn't like more of a man than someone else because they don't have like, if you don't produce gametes, that doesn't make you less of a man. And if you're not born with a uterus, that doesn't make you less of a woman. That's complete bullshit. And that's kind of what this idea of like spectrum in a way suggests, because it kind of suggests it's one dimensional, and it's more that it's a whole cluster of different properties and different dimensions, all with their own different values. And
I guess I'll just add to that, much like a lot of the examples we looked at so far, where boxes are made by humans, like what a species is and so on. The same is true for genders, whilst there obviously are two different types, and when you're looking from a kind of simplistic view, where was I going with this? Saying that, what were we just talking about?
spectrum.
What some people would say is a more of a male characteristic, more of a female characteristic. A lot of that stuff is kind of made up, isn't it? So
yeah, exactly.
And there's just because you don't have a deep voice and super strong doesn't mean you're less of a male, and just because you like to wear trousers and climb trees makes you less of a female, because a lot of those female characteristics were imposed by the patriarchy and were a way of suppressing one of the two kind of sexes that were accepted at the time by that society.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, there's a whole load of social construct on all of these things, but
really
particularly
complex.
presentation and stuff, and it's all kind of garbage. People should be able to do what they want without judgment in all of those domains. Wear what you want, have sex with who you want, consenting, and be who you want healthily. And I think that's it's important.
Just being kind to each other and supportive.
Don't be a dick. So anyway, I think that was our questions. Thank you very much for our question asker.
There was one question earlier on about DNA, and isn't it true that a lot of our DNA doesn't code for anything? It was from a bit further up. Oh, that was earlier on than that.
How do you get the wing virus? Good question. When we find out...
So isn't it true that we don't use a lot of our genes in our DNA? Yes.
Done.
And actually, people, when the human genome was first sequenced, they were saying, there's so much nonsense and junk DNA that serves no purpose. Well, a lot of that actually was, again, kind of turned on its head, and it was just that we didn't realise what the purpose was. And a lot of this stuff is regulatory and so many complex things that we still don't really understand we certainly don't understand what all of our DNA is there for.
There's a very interesting final fact that I'm going to deliver is that most mammals have a gene which allows them to synthesize their own vitamin C, but no primate. So all primates have that gene, but it's switched off by another gene. And so humans and monkeys and great apes and stuff, we have the gene, but it doesn't work. And that's why we get scurvy if we don't eat vitamin C. And it's not really an evolutionary advantage because it hasn't cut it out of our genetic pool. I guess perhaps it saves on energy, but we eat so much fruit in the wild that we don't need to produce our own vitamin C, whereas Poppy here has to synthesize her own vitamin C from the fish that she relentlessly eats and what she's asking for now.
That's probably something as well we should discuss next time, which is manipulation of DNA to serve a purpose. So you mentioned having the genes to produce a particular vitamin but not having them switched on. The same is true for rice and vitamin A. So there's a famous genetically modified crop called golden rice where the genes have been edited to allow vitamin A production to happen in the grain. And so it looks yellow because vitamin A is basically beta-carotene, which is the kind of orange pigment that you get in carrots. And if you are majorly deficient in vitamin A in your diet, then it can lead to night blindness. So when they say eating carrots helps you see in the dark is not completely wrong.
It's not total.
It's not an all wives' tale.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's something that we should bring up next time, because also there's lots of discussion around the function of males in society and the use of the Y chromosome.
Just get rid of them, I think.
And how you can overcome a lot of the issues, infertility issues through genetic engineering, and maybe one day we can do without the Y chromosome.
Without the men, yeah. Anyway, thank you very much for everyone watching. I think that we've covered quite a lot of ground here and it's been really interesting. I've really enjoyed talking with Rose about all this biology stuff. We'd love to do a part 2. I think we probably will do a part 2. So if you have anything that when you're watching back and we've glossed over, or any questions, write them in the comments. We'll address all the questions that you come up with in the next episode. And I guess we'll probably talk more about this. We glossed quite over epigenetics, we'd glossed over sex differentiation, we glossed over
genetic engineering.
There's
sex determination,
transhumanism. There's loads of stuff to cover.
There's so much
it's
stuff.
Really interesting.
The female part of adult human female was the biggest topic by far,
and we covered that the smallest. So
we want to spend more time on it.
Shout out to all of the people who are going to go through this and try and clip out a quote to dunk me with on Twitter. Go for it.
Likewise. So, sorry again if I said something stupid. But I just want to say to Katie, thanks very much for having me on.
No problem. It's been really fun.
Genuine celebrity friend now with all your internet presence, because I don't really do very much online. And so it's a bit like, you have how many followers? So it's been really nice. I've thoroughly enjoyed myself. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming. Right, okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye. See you next time.
I don't know if this is recording now or not. I'm just going to kill it.
Don't you want to wait till we say goodbye?
I don't know.
Wait. Oh.
Oh, there you go. We're waved. Yeah.